All right, I'm officially recording, so I guess it's time to start class. So before we get started on today's activity, I do want to talk really quickly about some things for the future. So I'm working ahead, and we're starting to look at plans for what we're going to be doing for part 3. So just for context, part 1 is where we're at, or I guess section 1, where we're talking about financial transactions and fraud schemes. Next part is going to be fraud prevention and deterrence, and then we're going to get into investigation starting in week 7, and then week 8, 9, and 10. When we get to investigation, the case format is going to change a little bit. So you know how you're doing presentations on cases right now. We're going to actually do something different, which I don't want to spoil right now because I think it'll be a lot of fun, but it'll be substantially different. That being said, it's going to require that we maintain groups for a 3-week period. Now, currently, the way things work is that we swap groups every week, so that's beneficial in the fact that you don't know who you're gonna have to work with, so you have to actually make do with who you're assigned with and learn to integrate with other people, which I think is really important because that's what you're going to be doing in the real world too. You don't necessarily get to choose people you get to be in a group with. That being said, the 1-week rotation is kind of beneficial in the fact that if somebody just gets on your nerves, then you only have to be handle them a week and then move on. It's like say Jenna and Kirsten are in a group together, and they're just kind of braiding each other and getting problematic. After a week, they're just kind of like, done. Don't have to worry about this again, unless of course they get assigned to another group, which I would never do that. So yeah. Obviously, I'm teasing Jen and Kirsten since they're roommates, but yeah. So my preference is that we do the random assignment for this 3-week period, and that people just kind of tough through it and accept that if they're in a group that they like, great. If you're in a group you don't like, you're professional enough, you handle it. However, I do want to leave it open to you all. If you have any strong opinions one way or the other, feel free to reach out to me and let me know. Because there will be some specific deliverables that I'll be expecting for this 3-week case assignment. And if you're comfortable with working with anybody, which I think most people in the classroom are, that's fine. But if you're not comfortable with working with certain people, then I may suspend random case assignments and try to do what I think would be appropriate for groups of 3 based on what I know, because I can tell by your interactions who everybody is kind of friends with. I mean, except for Kyle. I haven't figured Kyle out yet, but we can work through that if that's necessary. So please think about that. Today we're doing financial and fraud schemes, transaction fraud schemes part 2. So we're getting a little bit more into detail about data schemes around data, information, and financial transactions. We did occupational fraud last week, and occupational fraud is pretty much a reflection of everything that you've learned about in accounting so far. So some of the things we're going to talk about today, they're going to sound familiar, but they're not going to be things that we specifically talked about from an accounting context. So this will be an opportunity for us to learn a little bit more and apply some information in contexts that are a little bit less apparent to us. So we had to do some research, and again, I want to reiterate a point, something that I can't reiterate enough. This assignment was completable, just doing web searches, but it's going to get harder and harder to do that if you don't have access to the fraud examiner's manual. And next week will be particularly difficult if you don't have access to the fraud examiner's manual. So again, at the minimum, I would encourage you to reach out to your group members for next week and say, does somebody have fraud examiner's manual? And if you're one of those fortunate people that does, great. If not, I would at least make one person does. I'm not going to say it's going to be impossible to complete next week's assignment, but it's entirely based on information in the fraud examiner's manual. So we'll do a lot more searching. It'll require a lot more searching on your part if you don't have access to it. Okay. So please keep that in mind. All right, moving on. Let's just go ahead and get into the questions and talk a little bit about what context you need to understand this detail. So we're starting off big. We're talking about corporate espionage. Okay, so whenever you hear espionage, you think of spy thrillers like Mission Impossible movies. Tom Cruise dangling from the ceiling in a room that if he makes any sound, the alarm's going to go off. Obviously, we're not talking about something that serious, but what, in your own words, what is corporate espionage? And so, Brock, I'm really interested in hearing what your own words on corporate espionage are.
Okay. Hopefully they're my own words and not Google's.
I'm assuming that you and Google are just like this, you know? Yeah.
We think a lot. Illegally or unethically stealing confidential business information to gain an advantage.
Yeah. Okay. So it's important to note that there's a really important note there. Now, you could talk about when we talk about espionage, obviously it's covert, and I think that that's an important aspect of the definition. But the far more important aspect of this definition is illegal. All right. So we need to understand that aspect of information, and the important reason is because we're going to actually explain the difference between that and competitive intelligence. So competitive intelligence. A process by which competitive data are assembled into relevant, accurate, and usable knowledge about competitors. So sure sounds a little, the definitions sound very similar, but there's a really big distinction between those, okay? So let's go ahead and let's just clarify this. Corporate espionage is illegal by nature, all right? Competitive intelligence, okay, competitive intelligence, is that illegal? No. Can it be shady at times? Probably so, but keep in mind that competitive intelligence is the way which corporations and companies gain competitive advantage. We can actually use it for fraudulent purposes if it's not utilized or controlled properly, but for the most part, it's basically something every organization does in order to process to maintain a competitive advantage. And we talked a lot about this in previous undergraduate classes. We talked about the nature of proprietary information and proprietary rights and the details that are associated with that. One of the big issues with accounting is how much information do you want to share in accounting? So those financial statements that are published on the websites, okay, is that all information that accounting a firm produces with respect to accounting? No, it's a summary of information. So why don't accounting firms produce all information? Why don't they make all of their information available? Well, the problem is that they make all their accounting information, their business and operational information, then their competitors have access to that information too and can take advantage of that. So there's a dividing line of what's going to be the information that we want to actually have and what information we want to kind of hide, I guess, for lack of a better term, we want to disguise. Competitive intelligence is basically taking advantage of any information that you have about your competitors and their operations and using that for your own benefit. And again, it sounds nefarious, but it's not, because I think every single one of us are going to do that. All right. And that's something that you all naturally do in your day-to-day operations. I won't say that you're competing against people in the class. I mean, maybe you are. Okay. Maybe Lotus and Megan there are thinking about how they can one up each other. And if you are, well, good on you. Okay. So, but every day. Okay. But yeah, so take a competitive advantage of that. But so there's more likely when we talk about competitive intelligence is more about thinking about what your instructors are looking for and trying to find the most optimal way to produce that. All right. For me, I'm pretty straightforward. I was like, follow the instructions of the assignment. For Dr. Caden, it's like, who only knows? All right. Yeah. So it really depends on the nature of the instructor. And so trying to gain the advantage of that information is really important. All right, shifting focus. Let's talk about identity theft schemes. All right. So what are some types of identity theft schemes? Nina, what does your group identify in this?
Some types of identity theft schemes are financial, medical, insurance, tax, employment schemes. And we said that financial schemes seem to be the most common, like opening lines of credit.
Yeah. So yeah, those are kind of a good summary of the ones that I identified. I think we could probably say that there's some of the other ones that were identified in the fraud exam panel. They identified criminal schemes and business schemes. I would say the ones you identified are the most important because criminal schemes probably are overlap in a lot of different categories, so it's not necessarily to distinguish those, and the business schemes for the same reason. So specifically, I would like to make sure that we know financial schemes, medical, insurance, tax, and employment schemes. Those are all going to be very important. So financial schemes, I think that we can readily accept that these are probably going to be the most common schemes that occur in frequency. And the nature of that is going to be pretty obvious, is that we're trying to maintain or gain a financial advantage in these schemes, which ultimately criminal fraudulent schemes, what are we trying to do? We're trying to better our position. And most of the times that's from a financial perspective. So that's pretty apparent, a pretty apparent association. All right. So financial institution fraud and payment fraud. So we've got these concepts. These are obviously fairly related. We're jumping around here, related here, but there's a distinction that we're going to have to make here. So I asked in question number 3, what is the difference between financial institution fraud and payment fraud? And Maddie, your group is up on this one.
So that financial institution fraud is fraud that occurs within or against financial institutions, And payment fraud is the unauthorized use of stolen payment information. And I said like an example of financial institution fraud would be like check or mortgage fraud, whereas like payment fraud would be like stolen credit card or bank account information.
Okay. Is it possible to have a fraud that actually exploits both categories or falls in both categories? Yeah, it is, but there is kind of a distinction line. So your definition falls pretty much in line with mine. I defined financial statement fraud as an external fraud scheme, which would be fraud by a group or individual against an organization. So against a bank, savings and loan, credit union, or other governmentally insured repository. So basically a financial institution. So financial institution fraud is a fraud against a financial institution. All right. And hopefully that definition, it makes sense. All right. Everybody on board with that one, financial institution fraud against a financial institution, these are the things you pay me the big dollars for, guys. All right. To give these detailed definitions. Now, payment fraud schemes, they generally exploit individuals. Now, you could actually say they exploit organizations, and they do in some scenarios, but generally their views, they exploit individuals into paying for goods and services they did not receive. Okay, so the kind of the traditional payment scheme is going to be is a good one, an example, and there's a wide variety of how we can categorize these. But everybody remember from you probably didn't experience this personally, but you heard about this. It's been 10 to 20 years ago, the Nigerian Prince scheme. Okay, there was a whole bunch of different variations on the scheme. You receive an email says, "I'm a Nigerian prince. I have a lot of assets, but I'm trying to flee my country. So can you please take these into your own possession? And in doing so, I'll pay you a fraction of whatever they're worth. Oh, by the way, you'll need to set up a Western Union account and wire me X dollars in order to be able to set up this transaction fee." It was a very, very simple scheme. It's like you send them a payment and they never deliver anything. And so that was kind of and there's a lot of variations on the scheme as that can take place. It was very, very well known and exploited, especially in the early days of email as a business function. So yeah, so we're going to kind of keep that in mind when we talk about financial statement fraud. We're specifically talking about the fraud that goes against the financial institutions, whereas payment fraud can be multivariate and diverse. And it's possible that you can have stuff that overlaps both categories, but for the most part, we want to make a little bit of a distinction there. All right, this one's kind of an interesting one because we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but I said, in your opinion, and if you looked forward, if you opened the document and started to try to find information on this, you cheated, okay? And I'm disappointed in you. I saw Tyler's face scrunch up. Tyler, did you cheat? Okay, maybe a little. All right. The first step to fixing fraud is admitting that you committed the fraud. Yeah. So no. So I wanted to identify which of the following information, in order from most important to least important, to collect on a potential new business vendor and a customer. All right. So Leah, this is basically asking what your group did for the first try at this. All right. And what did your group identify as the most important information versus the least important?
We had 3 different orders of opinion. Kyle and I both thought tax ID number was number 1, while Dylan thought it was number 4.
Okay.
So it's a little different there. Kyle and Dylan thought bankruptcy history was 2, while I thought business ID was 2. And then Kyle and I both thought criminal records was 4. Dylan thought criminal records was 3. And then I thought bankruptcy history was 3. So
Okay.
all a little different.
So a little bit of deviation in perspective, okay, and some insight. Obviously, very well-educated people that thought about it from a rational perspective. I think the intuition of somebody outside of this probably would not be as apparent, but I think you all also knew that I may have been trying to trick you with this question. So that was kind of the direction I have you go, and you were a little bit dubious. That interesting that given that this is an individual question, you had so much deviation in the answers, and I respect all 3 group members' opinions very highly. So I think it's profound that one of these answers, 2 of you found was number 1 and the other one's like number 4. Okay. It's very, very interesting. Now I'm not trying to make any judgment. It's more along the lines of it's not a clear consensus. It's not a clear answer. Did all the other groups kind of find a similar pattern? There was no real consensus as to what the answers are. Again, if you look forward, you can find out what the answers are. And I encourage you to read ahead. This was that kind of defeated the purposes activity. Let's just let's find out. So Dottie, I'm curious what your group said on this one.
We also put criminal records is number 4, and then for 2 and 3, it was ID verification and bankruptcy.
Okay, so a little bit more consensus on this one, but still some dispute as to what was going to be the case. And again, we'll see what's going on. There's possibility of doing research to find this information out. I will be honest, this is the first time I looked at this information, and what my intuition behind this was not nearly consistent with what was said in the benchmarking report. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and why it's not necessarily transparent, but why it makes more sense once we move forward. All right, so moving on to question 5. All right, you guys knew it was coming, so we had to talk about it because it's a Dr. Barnes class, so we have to talk about controls. All right, just no way around it. Some of the tax folk are saying, I thought I got away from that. No, you will never get away from controls, no matter what, okay? No matter what. So what are some preventative controls that would have helped prevent the various types of data that help prevent the various types of data theft or intellectual property? And why are these controls easier said than done? All right, so Matt, what'd your group say in this particular instance?
So we said multi-factor authentication, firewalls, periodic bank reconciliations, and employee training.
Okay, good. So multi-factor authentication, can you repeat the second one again?
Firewalls,
Firewalls, and then employee training?
periodic bank
Regular bank reconciliations, okay, and then
employee
employee
training.
training. Okay, so I want to kind of make a distinction there because I think that those are very, very profound and they all follow, they're all very good. I think we could probably go down a rabbit hole here and talk about a lot of different ones. Those are not, it's not a comprehensive list, and I was not expecting a comprehensive list, but I do think that those are a good overlap. So one of the things that's important to note is that employee training was kind of listed there along with other things that tend to be a function of the system and the organization itself. So we can generally categorize controls in this area into 2 categories, okay? We can talk about personal responsibility, which are going to be responsibilities of the individuals in the organization, and organizational controls. And so why are these controls easier said than done? Well, let's talk about each of these individually. Let's talk about the categories individually. All right, so for personal responsibility, they can be promoted through good training and organizational culture, but it can be difficult to force adoption, particularly as new protocols are adopted over time. Now, easy way to think about this is you adopt a new system and you say, well, we're going to do these new protocols, we're going to do these new systems, and you've got to be able to adapt to them. And I would say something like multi-factor authentication may even fall into this category, depending on whether it's required for adoption or not. But you've got individuals in the organization say, I do not want to go through this. I like the way things used to be. I don't see the reason for change. That is one of the biggest impediments to adoption of new controls, is when people say that, I don't like change. How many people in this room say they really love change? Okay. I think everybody can agree that change is inconvenient. It's not something that we enjoy doing, but it's a necessary function of evolution in any category, in any context we talk about. So we need to make people understand that we're not doing change for the sake of change. It's not just doing something new. As much as I despise change, I recognize the importance. And sometimes I get really, really antsy, and I especially when I'm working with executives at Truman and administration at Truman, and they say, we're making this change. And I said, what was the purpose of this change? Clearly define this change for me, because I have to understand it, okay? I need that understanding of change if I'm going to accept it. But that's something that not everybody is willing to do, especially in this day and age. It's certainly problematic. So the acceptance of change is problematic. Now, organizational controls themselves are likely to be more adaptive or effective in that regard, but they're ultimately going to be more costly. All right. So one of the things that the Fraud Examiner's Manual identifies is electronic counter surveillance. All right. How many organizations do you think can effectively implement electronic counter surveillance as a control in this area? I think we can go down to the Greek corner years, and they say we're a little bit concerned that we may have people that are on our network that are that are capturing credit card information. And so we as a class trying to come up with a solution, we say, we think you should do electronic counter surveillance, okay? So it sounds like a great idea in function, but in practice, it's not necessarily one of those things that we can do. So organizational controls, generally more effective, but also generally more costly, which is why we have to rely on individuals to be able to do their job and follow their responsibility. Now, again, we're not really talking about anything new. This is actually a reflection of what we've talked about in multiple previous classes before, but still a very important characteristic that we need to know. All right, we're moving back to identity theft. Okay. With respect to identity theft, what groups are at the highest risks and what do these groups have in common? Brock, we're back to you. What groups did your team identify?
So it's seniors and young kids. And then also just social media users or people who have a lot of their information on them.
So that's an interesting one. I want to talk about that, but I think the first two groups are good. Do you have any others?
No, we didn't have any others.
Okay.
So, in common, I said that these groups are less tech savvy, so it's easy to.
Yeah, so I want to kind of keep social media users as compartmentalized because I think that they're a little bit distinct from that. I do think that's an interesting point, and I really would like to talk about that. But my list is a little bit more detailed: children, seniors, military members, college students, and the deceased. Okay, now what do these groups have in common? Especially when we talk about children and seniors, they frequently have little understanding and do not or frequently have a little understanding of their technological details, identity details. Problematic, obviously, when you're very, very young and you have very little capacity or understanding of technical details, or when you're older and your mental capabilities are going. And we're going to talk a little bit about elder fraud next week. Elder fraud is certainly a big concern in this day and age, and they're a very, very easy target, which is problematic. We need to understand what is our responsibility in that regard. But some interesting ones: military members, college students, and the deceased. Okay, so that does not necessarily fall into the same category as little understanding. They may have strong understanding, but when we talk about these groups, they generally do not frequently monitor their personal information. Okay, particularly if we're talking about military members who are on deployment, they may not have access to electronic media for long periods of time. The deceased, we're going to say the deceased probably do not monitor their activity very frequently. Okay, just for natural reasons. Okay, and college students. I mean, how frequently do you all check your email relative to like a professional setting? I will say, just based on my understanding, when I send out an email, some students will reply very, very quickly. Some students, I'll send out an email, say reply ASAP, and then 5 days later, I get a response. Okay, so it really depends. It's kind of spurious. I will say Truman students are probably a lot stronger than other students, but whereas we got social media users that are very, very active on TikTok or Yik Yak, is that a new thing right there? Yeah, GroupMe. You know, those same people probably don't check their email, but may a few times a day. So that's really concerning. So that's going to make their groups attractive targets. Now, with respect to social media users, this is not one that was on my list, but I think that's an interesting target, or they're an interesting target. Why do you think social media users, particularly like widely acknowledged social media users, might be good targets? So I think the recognizability, the transparency is probably one big area right there. And if we're talking about like big media users, they probably have some controls over their systems. But talking about just frequent social media users, people who use social media on very frequent occasions, we already know from previous courses that social media platforms do not implement the same level of controls that they probably, or the level of controls they probably should to prevent identity theft, or at least the compromise of information or identity. We talked about Cambridge Analytica back in Advanced AIS. Remember Cambridge Analytica and I think it was Advanced AIS, maybe it was original AIS. One of those two courses, I get them all confused. But Cambridge Analytica, remember they were the Facebook platform that was gathering information that was supposed to be voluntary. But the voluntary aspect of it is that if you volunteered every single person on your friends list as well. All right. And so I think that's a big lapse of controls, and we don't necessarily look for that. Like, how many people, when you do something on social media that requires consent, you read through that entire contract line by line and work through it word by word? Anybody read through it line by line? Matt, I'm surprised to see you admit that. You'd be the person I thought would admit it. Oh, that's right. Okay, that's right. I remember we've had this conversation. Okay, if you were on social media, would you read through it line by line? Probably. Okay. All right. So we got one person who's willing to do it for us. All right. So yeah, certainly some concerns in that regard. We don't necessarily take our own precautions as necessary with respect to that. So it's very, very concerning there. All right. Moving on. What's a wire transfer? Nina, what's a wire transfer?
Wire transfer is electronically transferring money from one account to another.
Okay. And so this is interesting because the fraud examiner's manual talks about wire transfer as a form of fraud. And we talk about wire transfers as a form of fraud. Are we talking about traditional wire transfers, like the types of wire transfers that existed 50 years ago? Is that what it's referring to? It includes that, yes. But wire transfers is basically any electronic means of transaction, sending transactions. Now, think about this. If we go back 50 years, wire transfers did exist. They've been existed for like about 80 years. All right. And so a wire transfer was you go to one financial institution, say, I'd like to send money to a different location. And so they would send it to a different financial institution where somebody at that financial institution would pick up. So like, say you've got a family member that lives in a different city, and you say, I want to send $50 to my family member. You would go to a bank or to like a Western Union outpost and you'd say, I'd like to send $50. They electronically transfer that information or transfer information to another financial location, and that somebody picks it up. That's the traditional wire transfer. All right. And we know that wire transfers still exist in that capacity, but are electronic transfers that complex anymore? So if I asked you to Venmo me some money right now, could you? Would you? Probably not. I hope not. Okay. Yeah. Just don't. That's a fair statement. Okay. But then I also hold the power of your passing this class in my hand. So yeah. Yeah. That's where everybody storms up. So Dr. Caden, Dr. Barnes is threatening us. Yeah. 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 That's a fair statement. So yeah. You could send me money if you wanted to and be much easier. Now, do the same risks exist that existed 80 years ago? Yes, the same risks exist, plus a multitude of other risks, okay? So we're considered about wire transfer schemes. There's a lot of categories that could actually follow this under. So which category of fraud schemes, financial institution fraud or payment fraud, is more likely to use wire transfers as part of the fraud? This is a trick question, okay? So Maddie, I'm throwing the trick question at you. And I would say that's a correct statement. We're thinking about traditional wire fraud, okay? But if we're thinking about more common day wire fraud, the broader statement of wire fraud, I would say it's more of a means of payment fraud scheme. So there was no wrong answer to this one, but unfortunately, there was no right answer to this one either. So, but yeah. Traditionally, wire fraud's a means of facilitating financial institution fraud. However, the proliferation of low friction electronic transaction methods has made wire transfers an area where payment fraud schemes have flourished, okay? And there's a wide variety of payment fraud schemes. We've seen examples of these back in advanced AIS. We talked about ransomware. Ransomware employs payment fraud schemes in that scenario. Now, you may say that the payment itself is not the fraud in that scenario because you know exactly who you're sending money to, but it's facilitated through exchange of a non-transparent payment system when you use cryptocurrency in that exchange. So that's kind of an example of a payment fraud that would proliferate as a result of these low friction processes, okay? Now, as question 8, something I alluded to, wire transfers have been around for 80 years. And what really bothers me about that statement is if you look at this word wire, the W in wire is in a different font than everything else. Okay, so I'm not sure why that's the case, but that's a document. That's just something I noticed, actually. With regards to our changed society, how do you think the risk of wire fraud has changed over the years? We've talked a little bit about this, but let's go into a little bit more detail. Dottie, Leah, what did your group say?
He said cash checks are a lot now.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of huge fraud.
Not very many people physically go to the bank anymore, so it's just again.
Right. So how do most transactions do we think occur nowadays? I think most transactions occur electronically. So we talked about last week that cash is the most liquid item. And if we talked about transfers the way that we wish they would occur, cash would be the exchange that we'd want to facilitate. Now, that's not necessarily something we have to avoid through electronic transfers. We can have electronic transfers of cash, quote unquote. But the easiest way would be to break into somebody's house, open their bank or open their safe, break in their safe, take the money, put it into a bag, put it in a box, and then don't touch it for like 20 years and then come back and be wealthy. That's the theme of really, really old movies. Now you get these modern day movies that are talking about, all right, we're going to hack their financial institution system and we're going to take the money from their bank account. Why? Because people don't carry large volumes of cash anymore. At least most people don't. It's actually interesting to me because one thing that I've noticed, I still carry this wallet and it's really beaten up. I've actually got a new wallet for Christmas. I just haven't adapted to it yet, but I still carry physical cash in there. And I see other people talk about their wallet and they say wallet, and I see what their wallet is. And their wallet is basically something that's clipped to the side of their phone. Okay, it's got a few credit cards and maybe their ID to it, and that's their wallet. All right, that's what their wallet is, because most people don't carry cash anymore. And so it's very interesting with the proliferation of the use of electronic transactions, then we're going to actually have to adapt to that. Or we notice that wire fraud is adapted to address that particular problem. And I would say the majority of payment fraud schemes now exist within that realm. They don't necessarily follow the way the methods that were used previously. Again, that being said, these can be for traditional cash transactions, because we do know that cash is electronically conveyed, but we're starting to see a lot more evolution in that regard. It could actually be for assets that are non-cash assets. Particularly when we talk about crypto assets and exchange in this way, that's another area of concern, because those have a lot less transparency associated with them. All right, we're going to the benchmarking report now. So according to figure 1 of the benchmarking reports, what percentage of ACF members said that an onboarding new business as a new vendor or customer is at least moderately challenging? All right, so we'll just pull up the figure here. Okay, so figure 1, it basically says 52% of customer and 61% of vendor. And then moving back to the question, compare these results to the percentage that believe the onboarding programs are effective. Okay, so let's just go ahead and go figure 2. Which is 87% customer and 87% vendor. So kind of overlap. Now the distribution is a little bit different, but they're both 87%. All right. Do you believe there's a correlation between these assessments? Dottie, what'd your group say on this particular situation?
So, we said that they're likely to be correlated, is nevertheless effective onboarding process, it's probably going to be challenging.
Right. So if we're talking about the challenges of onboarding, there would be an importance of need for good process. Okay. Now, this is interesting because you'll notice that it's 87%, which is overwhelming, say at least moderately effective. Do we think that there may be some overconfidence in this assessment? Because keep in mind, this is actually from a survey of ACFE members. All right. And so that signals to me when you think said something is at least moderately effective, at least overconfidence in that regard, particularly when we talk about the disparity between the percentages between the two figures. Okay, so there could be a signal of overconfidence, but the most part we talk about onboarding a new customer. Now, let's make sure that we understand the definition here. We talk about onboarding. Usually, that's reserved for onboarding as like a new employee. We talk about a new vendor, a new customer. What does that mean? It means basically we want to engage in transactions with a new business partner, whether this be buying from a vendor or selling to a new customer. Are there risks associated with bringing any new business partner into an organization? It's a pretty easy question. I gave you a softball question on that one, guys. The answer is yes. Okay, the answer is yes. Your answer by now should be, Dr. Barnes, if it's your class, it's a risk associated with anything. Okay, there's risks associated with everything, Dr. Barnes. We've come to accept that. So if you say, are there risks? Your head should start nodding before I even finish the question. Okay, head should start nodding. So let's try this. Are there risks? Yes. Okay, good. All right. So in this regard, we need to understand that there have to be clear onboarding protocols in place for accepting new customers and new vendors. And we know that there are risks. What do we characterize as those? Well, fictitious vendors might be problematic. If we don't have good processes in place to verify the identity of a vendor, then we could actually send money to a vendor for orders and they receive the check and never send us goods. Similarly, we have fictitious customers. We send them out goods and they never pay us back. We extend them credit. All right. Those are all pretty traditional fraud schemes that we talked about in undergraduate courses that still rely on making sure there are good processes in place. So that's why this process is so important. Now, the last question reflects back to our previous question and actually relates to this whole idea. Okay, if we want to make sure that we've got good vendors and good customers that are not going to rip us off, what are the most important criteria? What are the most important aspects? So scrolling down, figure 10, I should have written down the page number, but we'll get there eventually. Figure 8, figure 9. Oh, wait a minute, that was figure 10. All right, so for both customer and vendor, our order was going to be based on question 4, okay, as Leah and her group and Dottie and her group identified, is that it was going to be tax ID number was number 1. And then ID verification of business owners was number 2. So basically we had these individual identifications and then criminal records and bankruptcy down here. I'm not going to say they're not important. Okay, give in mind they've got to make a distinction. We're talking about 86 or around 85% and then around 75% right up here to 54% and 50%, or 55 and 50% roughly, okay? So still a majority in every single area says these are important. But what are more important in context? It's identification information. Now, the important question here is why? Matt, you get the difficult question, why?
I'm sorry.
So why is tax ID number and ID verification of business owners? Why are these at top? And criminal records and bankruptcy histories are down here at the bottom. So first of all, the question was, do your rankings differ from the ACFE member rankings? And I used that kind of as an answer to say, for some regard, we had some alignment, but we did have some deviation, okay? So why do the ACFE member rankings differ from ours? And why do we have tax ID number and ID verification sitting at the top? What's the importance of that?
Well, we just don't really think about tax ID number being that important, but it is because that's tied to your social security number.
Yeah.
And fraud detection.
So what were the examples that I used for vendor and customer fraud? What were the two examples that I used? I used a word to describe them. Begins with the letter F, not that word. Fictitious, okay? Fictitious, okay? What's the easy way to determine that something is not fictitious? To determine it actually exists, okay? If it has a tax ID number, it's likely to exist. Now, I know that you could say, Dr. Barnes, I've heard stories of dachshunds who were assigned tax ID numbers, and there's stories of that are true, okay? But for the most part, if we're talking about a legitimate business that has a tax ID number that are associated with it, it's going to be something that we can engage in transactions with. Similarly, ID verification of the business owner. If we know that this is a existing human being, then it's probably going to be somebody who actually engages in those transactions in a legitimate nature. We don't have to worry about fictitious existence of individuals or entities that might try to commit fraud. Now, are these going to be something of relevance? Criminal records check or bankruptcy history? Certainly, we want to make sure that if we engage in business transactions, that we want to know criminal records if they engaged in fraudulent activity before. And we also like to know if they have a bankruptcy history as to whether or not when we do business, they're suddenly just going to collapse. But is that our primary concern? Our primary concern is kind of initiative at the beginning, making sure that if we engage in a transaction, it's with a legitimate entity or a legitimate human being. It's kind of our primary goal, the very first step. So that seems to be a simplification, but it actually explains why tax ID number and ID verification are at the top, and then criminal records and bankruptcy history are here at the bottom. All right, that was 10 questions in 40 minutes. Excellent work, guys. Everybody ready for a quiz? I see some shaking heads. Too bad. All right, so pause recording. All right, quiz should be available. Group 1, you are up. I know that's not group 1 slides, but I'll let them worry about the other slides up. Oh. You want to break? I have no idea. Just want to do like three. Yeah, you just should be opening a separate PowerPoint slide. Oh, I got you. What the heck?
All right, so we have the college admission scandal. We're doing the summary and the key parties involved, so.
There you go. The German state was false on there. All right.
So we have the Operation Varsity Blue scandal. It's the college one where a bunch of parents are paying this guy who we'll talk about in a little bit, basically paying him to increase his ACT, SAT scores to put them on special sports teams in order to get into these high-end colleges. So the mastermind, this is the main guy who's involved, Rick Singer. Basically, he was the one receiving all the money and then doing some underground work in order to get these students into big schools, get them on these sports teams. So he operated for a nonprofit college counseling service called Edge College and Career Network. He had a nickname, The Key. He started a nonprofit called Key Worldwide. So these parents were basically like giving money to this organization, and then he was profiting the money and then also paying other college coaches, which we'll go into. They also started a nonprofit, created the side door method, which basically his way of guaranteeing admission to any college that these parents wanted them to. The side door method, parents donated large amounts of money, between $250,000 and $400,000. This would also result as a tax benefit for Singer. Standardized test cheating, again, basically paying this guy in order to get them higher ACT scores, SAT scores. They had also fake athletic credentials. So there's a bunch of teams that we'll list on later on, but basically paying these coaches to get them on a team when they had no relation to playing that sport.
Most of the sports that they were using to were like not as popular and well-known sports, like rowing was the big one, and then there's other sports. I think fencing was one, like just like sports that you don't typically have like a lot of people getting their attention drawn to and watching.
It's like
So-
soccer.
Yes.
One of them was women's soccer.
One of them was
And he would hire people to impersonate students and go take their ACTs for them. And he would Photoshop photos of normal people's faces on pictures of athletes in action, which I thought was really funny.
So backdoor method, $40 to $50 million donation to the college. And they would say that it's hoping to better the odds for your kids, but there's no guarantee. He claimed that this method offered a better likelihood of success of admission for a bargain basement price. So how it ended and how he eventually got caught was securities fraud investigation led authorities to Yale's women's soccer coach who led them to Singer. And basically after Singer was caught due to this Yale's women's soccer coach, he wanted lower sentences and wanted to get out. So he cooperated with federal agents and basically kind of turned in everyone he was working with. So basically anyone who worked with him or paid him eventually ended up getting caught. It led to the indictment of parents, coaches, and test proctors, as well as widespread criticism of the privilege in elite college admissions.
So from 2011 to 2019, William Singer was said to receive $25 million that he said would guarantee their children admission. And then, like we said, once he got caught, he cooperated right away, and he would just wear a wire and call up the parents and just have a normal conversation about what was going on. And the authorities could tell that everybody was in on it and got clear evidence against everybody who was in on it. There was 30 to 50 people who paid him a lot of money. And his role as the middleman scandal exposed corruption in college administration. And yeah. This is just some other key parties who were affected. Lori Loughlin was an actress in the TV show we all know as children, Full House. And she paid this man. She ended up being charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud and mail fraud and served 2 months in prison, which included a $150,000 fine and 100 hours of community service, and was placed on 2 years of supervised release.
This was another popular guy. So obviously, like, the main key party was Singer, but also these parents, wealthy parents, and also like celebrity parents, paying him as well. He wanted to get his daughter into USC, and I guess she didn't have the qualifications to meet that, so he just paid him $500,000 and she got in, so he was a fashion designer. And then this was the woman that went into USC, Olivia Jade. She was a influencer, I believe. Some of you may know her, but so yeah, she was kicked out of the school, and yeah, just kind of all crumbled for all of them. So
Lost all her brand deals. No more influencer vibes.
oh, and so the coaches, some of the big ones that were involved, kind of like Colin talked about, the Yale women's soccer coach. There was a tennis coach from Georgetown, the USC AD, and others. So they were all fired for accepting bribes. Like it kind of looked like a scholarship donation. I think the other group might get into that a little bit, but obviously it was a bribe because they would just let the celebrities' kids go into the school. Yeah.
But I just wanted to clarify that I did not intentionally put 4 student athletes on this. Presentation. I did a randomization function in Excel, and I guess AI is taking over and so. All right, group 2.
So we're gonna talk about the risk and then like the solutions and the things we can learn. So we're gonna start with like the pressure. For Singer was obviously his monetary gain, and then also parents pressuring him to make sure that their kids got into the schools that they wanted them to get into. He had a great opportunity because he worked as like a college admissions counselor. And then there were coaches and test proctors in the position of power to accept the bribes and like fudge what they needed to get these kids into school. And then rationalization is that it kept working and everyone kind of got what they wanted. So parents and the students, like they got into the schools, the coaches, proctors, and Singer all got monetary.
So some solutions and lessons that we kind of learned from this is that obviously collusion is one of the hardest things to catch in fraud schemes, especially when it's happening at all levels, from the company to the clients to the third parties that are getting bribes. And some things that we said that might help reduce the probability of this happening again is stronger controls, especially for donations, like for like athletics and whatnot. Making sure that we properly vet those, trace the money back to where it came from, why they're giving the money. Especially frequent smaller donations in case they go like right underneath that flag amount. And also there should be a stronger like vetting process for third-party admissions counselors. We kind of said that it should be treated as like related party transactions for corporations. Like they should have to disclose that on applications if they use third-party admissions counselor.
We also stated that schools should work more directly with the student and not the third party counselor, because the student is more likely to, like, I don't know, want to say crack under pressure, but like they're the one who's taking the tests and doing all the stuff, so that everyone's the school should be interacting with. And for the admissions process, we said there should be a stronger segregation of duties to prevent conflict of interest with admissions and recruitment, to separate recruitment from athletics, and be stronger vetting when we recruit students for athletics. And we should verify the student plays the sports, looking into their statistics, and more documentation, like footage of the student playing the sport, and all that stuff, requiring documentation for extra test support to students who need extra time for different learning disabilities or attention disabilities, making sure that they have documentation for those extra time requirements, and creating a whistleblowing mechanism for the schools that would also influence a more ethical culture of school as well.
Seems like pretty reasonable control to say that if you're gonna hire some, or you're gonna recruit somebody to play a sport, that you should actually be able to identify that they've played the sport before, so. Okay. Jim? I would just like to point out something that I noticed on the slide. If you notice the bribe that's in the middle of the slide, the picture there, it starts out with two $100 bills, and the denomination's really shrinks quickly. Does a whole bunch of $1 bills at the end. I'm not sure how motivated I'd be by that bribe right there. Group 3.
All right, so we had the identity theft tax fraud scheme. So the main perpetrator was Nikisha Hall. She was the one who worked for the tax advocacy service, who was supposed to help people who had been affected by identity theft and who were having trouble with the IRS. And she, I guess, thought it was a good idea, like the identity theft part. So the next person is Abdullah Coleman. It was just an assistant perpetrator. There wasn't much detail about this person in what we read, but they were part of the like group that was like getting the money and then like the checks and yeah. And then Jimmy Goodman was another assistant perpetrator, the same as Abdullah Coleman. There wasn't like a much differentiation between these two people. And then the last named person was LaShawn Robertson. And they were kind of separate, like slightly in from what Abdullah Coleman and Jimmy Goodman were doing. And then the last person was not named, but they said that there was someone else who was a part of this game. So. Okay, so now moving on to the summary. Nikisha started working for the IRS in 2007. She worked in an office which was called the TAS. It stands for Tax Advocate Service. And essentially she obtained information like names, dates of birth, and social security numbers through unauthorized access on IRS computers, and that started in 2008. And she specifically kept doing this until 2011 in the Birmingham office, and it's estimated that she stole around $550,000 to $1.5 million. Her and her co-conspirators also worked to obtain money from financial institutions like Bancorp. I don't know why it's blocked, but they just would get like debit cards from those financial institutions, and those debit cards were specifically for the purpose of accepting tax refunds. And yeah.
No, so I think you actually skipped the slide.
Oh, I switched on earlier.
Oh.
It made sense because the
Okay.
last one's the last thing.
Okay, cool. So the Nina, or that's not it. Nikisha. Sorry, God. Sorry, guys. So Nikisha, she did the bulk of the work. The main thing the other people did was, so she filed fraudulent tax returns with the IRS and directed the IRS to give the money back over debit cards that they delivered to drop addresses that Nikisha controlled. The other people, they found the addresses for her. So they're like, hey, well, we have this address set up, send it here, she sent it there, and then she'd give them a portion of the funds on the cards, and they would just split it between the 5 of them. Their contribution was they just picked out where the cards were going.
And fortunately, she has had job security since 2011. She's continued to work in the TAS offices in Salt Lake City, in New Orleans, and then in Omaha. So she's still working in this area, but the fraud's been caught, so, and out of Bangor. So hopefully there's no more.
The end.
Thanks, thank goodness it's been caught, you can't possibly do fraud again now. Group 4.
I think it's the first one. I think this is a good summary of what the group just presented over. Obviously, we said it's a subsidiary of the IRS, but same deal. So we thought that was fun. I did that big stuff. And I would like to make known, we did not copy the transitions. This was independent, but okay. So these are our fraud risk factors. As far as pressure, I mean, we kind of looked into some research on our own. Oh no. Spoilers. The median salary for the TAS is about 53,000, which isn't, I don't think, the worst salary in the world, but it's not like crazy. So this could be a good pressure for why all these individuals decided to get involved in this fraud. Also, it was just the lure of quick financial reward. This kind of goes with the ease of collusion. Like Matt said, the 4 other individuals involved didn't really do anything. They're like, oh, send the money here, and then they got money. So it's like, why? If they were even just a little bit not ethical, why would they not bank on that? Not saying it was right, but it's just like it was so easy. So that was a good pressure. But yeah.
Then moving on to opportunity, there was just a big, clear lack of access controls. The fact that Nikisha could access just about anyone's social security number, name, date of birth, without having to put in a password saying, oh yes, I'm the TAS agent assigned to X person, let me get their information. She could access just about anything. So that's not good. And then she was probably already working with individuals that had faced identity theft, at least to some extent. So if they've already been a victim of it once, oh, we can just make them a victim again, and it'll kind of blend together. We don't know who's doing what.
And then the last part of the triangle was rationalization. There wasn't, we had to infer just a little bit. She did say in statements that 1, she didn't think she would get caught, and 2, she was stealing from the government. She wasn't actually stealing from the people whose identity had been stolen, since she was just getting refunds from the government. So in her head, she wasn't hurting the people she was committing fraud about, but and that was pretty much everything for her.
I mean, if you're stealing from the government, it's really a crime.
Yeah, just take back your money.
And then overall lessons learned, there just needs to be better controls on sensitive information. So kind of like I was saying, if you're working on one person, you should have access to their information only. You shouldn't just be able to look up everyone. Management oversight is extremely important. Who was actually supervising Nikisha and how did they not figure out about this? Background checks on employees, we could kind of tell. Nikisha did this once, she might do it again. Let's maybe not hire her. You should get your refunds with ACH going straight to your bank account and not just getting a direct debit card, because anyone can use your debit card like they get in the mail. And then don't necessarily trust the IRS if your identity gets stolen. Maybe consult a tax professional and have them work at the IRS instead of just going straight to the IRS.
This one's obviously a little probably still trust the IRS, but maybe be really confident in their abilities. But yeah. So.
All joking aside, obviously, it's very easy to say don't trust the IRS, but we are going to talk a lot about tax fraud and how the IRS is severely underfunded right now and probably going to be further underfunded in the current administration. And when you have less resources, then it means you have less resources for controls and proper procedures. So.
All right, so we got the mortgage fraud conspiracy. So it's basically 3 real estate investors, and it's basically 2 different frauds, but they put them into one story, I guess, because it was a similar case. So we got Frederick Schulman, 72, Mark Stibler, and they were in the same fraud conspiracy. So they were both managing members at this Rhodium Capital Advisors, and their job was to buy and acquire apartment complexes. And this guy, Eli Paredes, and he owned one of the owners of Troy Technology Park and some third parties that were involved. There's like unnamed lenders and also a huge financing company, Fannie Mae.
So basically what happened is the Schulman guy and this Silver, they purchased an apartment complex that was worth 70 million. But they used like fake documents saying that the building was worth like that 95.8 million. And so they took that to the lenders and Fannie Mae. And so they were thinking that the complex was worth way more than it was, and then they could get a loan based on the overinflated price. And so then there were two closings, one for the real and then one for the fake.
So they thought, since the first one went so great, let's do it a second time. So in 2020, Peretz acquired another property called Troy Technology Park for 42.7 million. But they basically pretended that it was worth 70 million. So they created a fake letter of intent to purchase the property for 68.8 million from a third party that didn't exist. And because of that information, the lender funded a loan for $45 million. And to make it look like that they could close on that higher sales price, they took out a short-term loan of 30 million. And then they had two closings, one for the real 42.7 million price and one for the false 70 million price. They basically pretended it was worth more. They could get these giant loans.
I guess they just pocketed the rest, yeah.
So that's what you do with them, right? That way of putting your problem.
So our group also did the mortgage fraud conspiracy, and so we'll talk about the fraud risk factors and then the lessons learned. So the first part of the fraud risk triangle is pressure, and this one kind of goes with opportunity, but oftentimes when there's like financial concern going on in the economy, there's often less controls and there's a lot more fraud that's going on, and so there's less controls that are in place from stopping that from happening. So at this time, there was like COVID going on, and so a lot more people are getting away with fraud, and we can talk more about this in opportunity. The next pressure, the three managers, this one was kind of a stretch, but there's some sort of pressure to like obtain a loan for these buildings, and so they kind of saw the opportunity there to be able to to raise the price of to inflate the price of those buildings and pocket the extra money. Rationalization, stealing from a large government organization or sponsored organization like Fannie Mae. The rationalization there could be that they're not really stealing from a little guy. It's like this big corporation that they're stealing from. And then there's also lack of controls set in place, especially with the lenders and Fannie Mae. And so they figure that they could get away with it. So why not do the whole fraud scheme?
Now for opportunity, there's a little bit of overlap, like what she was saying, for lack of segregation of duties for corruption, they were able to influence and have the power to make these big loans and inflate the price. So yeah, they have the power to do the fraud scheme. And like we were talking about, when there's chaos, when people are hurting, it's a good opportunity to take advantage.
So some of the lessons learned, the first one is talking about like a crisis. When a crisis happens, there's opportunity for criminals to commit fraud. So definitely having controls to limit that opportunity and limit that risk. The second is having a control to flag huge disparities between amounts. They had a loan or they were purchasing the building for 70 million, but they were getting a loan for 95 million. So there's obviously an issue there. Again, there were forged documents and falsified documents in there to kind of help, muddy those waters, but also just better standards and controls and really having lenders do their due diligence. That's really what it boils down to. Making sure that lenders are checking with the appraisals to see that the asset that they're purchasing is worth what the loan is made for.
All right, so that wraps up another exciting day of fraud. We're going to wrap up fraud schemes and fraud detection or fraud schemes, whatever the name of the financial transaction, fraud schemes transactions next week. So we'll see y'all then. Have a good weekend.